Welcome everyone to Georgetown University. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be calling in from. My name is Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. As you can see, it's a beautiful spring day. It seems to be eternally a beautifully spring day in my Zoom background. But I want to welcome you here to what is in fact a beautiful spring day on the Georgetown campus. And we are excited to be hosting this event, the Road to COP26, from climate ambition to climate action. Let me start off, first of all, by thanking the sponsors of this event, Joanna Lewis and the Science, Technology, and International Affairs program here at the School of Foreign Service. Let me thank very much the speakers for taking time out of very, very busy schedules this week. It's an exciting and engaged week for being here. From Her Majesty's Embassy, the British Embassy. David Turk, Anthony Phillips is here from Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America. David Turk is here, the Deputy Secretary from the Department of Energy. Andrew Steer, the incoming CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund, and of course our own Milan Verveer from the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security. You know, at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University, since we're the oldest school of international affairs in the country, and we just celebrated 100 years, we tend to think about the long view, why we're created, what our mission was, and what the circumstances were that led to the creation of this school. And we were created in response to a truly global crisis. That was World War I and another pandemic, the Spanish flu. And now 100 years later, we think about what is going to motivate the need for creating new generations of leaders in the next century, and what the global issues are that are going to shape that new generation of leaders. And there are none more important than understanding the challenge of climate change. And there is, of course, a global engagement that is reaching stronger and stronger momentum of joint action, multilateral action, bilateral action, individual country action, local level action, that is driving a global response to this. And therefore, we want to be part of this incredible momentum to bring together leaders from all sectors that have to engage on this, to be thinking about what the next generation of solutions are going to be required to deal with this truly global crisis. And it's in that spirit that we're thrilled to be able to host this event today in advance of the COP26 meeting in the UK this November. And of course, as part of this extraordinary week here in the United States at the Leaders Climate Summit, which will come to fruition on Earth Day this week. So we're excited to be part of that momentum, part of that engagement. And I want to get started on this hour worth of what I'm sure is going to be, I think, important observations about our thinking about the future solutions, as well as an opportunity for you to ask questions of this distinguished panel. So let's get right to it. I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you the moderator for this event, Professor Joanna Lewis. She is our Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Energy and Environment. And she's also director of our Science, Technology, and International Affairs program, what we call STIA here at Georgetown, which mingles the critical importance of science and technology issues as part of a global affairs education. Dr. Lewis is also a faculty affiliate in the China Energy Group at the US Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. She's got a long career of engagement and experience working on international climate and clean energy policy with a focus on China, and has been really important in leading dialogues on the US-China climate engagement. And she's author of the award-winning book, Green Innovation in China. So we're thrilled to have her here to moderate this panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Joanna and look forward to our discussion. Thanks very much to everyone.
Thanks so much, Joel. So the COP26 Climate Summit, as we all know, will be hosted in the United Kingdom this November, and it's poised to be a pivotal moment in the global effort to combat the effects of climate change. As the successor to the COP21 Summit in Paris back in 2015, COP26 will be an important benchmark for determining progress countries around the world have made towards meeting the goals pledged there, and in announcing their next round of goals and long-term plans for decarbonizing their economies by mid-century, as well as in building capacity to help those countries most vulnerable to the effects of climate change. And of course, this week is US Climate Week as the Biden administration prepares to host the Leaders Climate Summit on Earth Day. So this seemed like an important time to explore what impact the United States re-entry into the Paris Agreement and this week's summit will have for COP26 outcomes, and what the world might expect from the United States as the Biden administration prepares to unveil its own climate goals. In addition, we'll explore the ambition for COP26 in Glasgow this November and the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on global climate efforts, as well as the opportunity that it presents for a green recovery. So I am thrilled to introduce you to our 4 panelists today. Anthony Phillipson, Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America and the British Consul General in New York. Previously, he has held numerous posts, including the Director for International Agreements and Trade and the British High Commissioner to Singapore. Dr. Andrew Steer, CEO and President of the Bezos Earth Fund, previously President and CEO of the World Resources Institute and Special Envoy for Climate Change at the World Bank. David Turk, Deputy Secretary at the United States Department of Energy, who was previously Deputy Executive Director at the International Energy Agency and has held many senior climate and energy roles across the United States government, including at DOE, State, and the National Security Council. And Ambassador Milan Vivir, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security here at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, who was previously the first US Ambassador for Global Women's Issues under President Obama and Chair and CEO of the Vital Voices Partnership. And please refer to the full bios of our distinguished panelists in the materials circulated for the event. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for this important conversation. So to kick us off, I would like to begin with a question for Mr. Phillipson. The United Kingdom and Italy are, of course, co-hosting COP26 this year and are also presiding over the G7 and the G20. The UK has made tackling climate change a top priority for the COP and the G7 presidency. Would you share with us what the UK is doing to build momentum on climate action during the course of this year in the lead up to COP26?
Thank you very much indeed. And it's a real pleasure to be invited to join this distinguished panel. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the views of the other panelists as well. As you say, we will co-host the COP summit with Italy this year. We were meant to co-host it last November. But of course, we got hit hard, as everyone has been, by the COVID pandemic and made it quite an early decision actually to slip it to this year. So it's really been a sort of a 2-year build-up. As you noted and noted in the introductory remarks, I mean, this is going to be a crucial moment for the world to come together to check in on how we're doing against our Paris commitments. I think we would probably suggest that we're not quite meeting our Paris commitments, so we need to re-energize commitment to those, but also, as you say, to set out what we're going to do going forward. I think we see ourselves as on a journey to net zero by 2050, as you say, but that means that we also need to check in on interim targets for 2030 and a whole series of other work streams. COP26 will be a moment for leaders to come together, not of course just leaders of countries, but leaders of companies, the private sector, academia, research institutes. This needs to be a really collective effort if we are going to meet our ambitions and targets and keep warming below 2 degrees. In terms of UK action as we build momentum, I just really wanted to highlight in the last few months 2, I think, really significant announcements by the UK government. First of all, in November last year, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced what he called a 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution. This mobilised almost $16 billion worth of government investment, which we hope will unlock about 3 times as much private sector investment by 2030, and supporting up to 250,000 jobs across all parts of the United Kingdom economy. The 10-point plan sets out a range of measures covering offshore wind, hydrogen, nuclear, electric vehicles, jet zero, greener maritime, public transport, cycling and walking, homes, public building, carbon capture and storage, nature, innovation and finance. And those last 2, I think, are really important from a UK perspective in terms of developing the cutting edge technologies we're going to need to deliver our energy ambitions and indeed our ambition to make the City of London the global centre of green finance. And obviously I say that with a degree of humility sitting here in New York, which I think is going to be another really crucial hub for that activity. All of that together is going to be necessary to make a vital contribution to enabling the UK to forge ahead in delivering our target, as I say, of net zero by 2050. And indeed, as the Prime Minister also says, echoing the President's words, building back better, building back greener, more sustainably from the COVID pandemic and the economic crisis. That series of announcements builds on, I think, what is already a strong track record of UK action and international leadership on climate. We had already announced $6.5 billion to deliver a domestic green recovery from COVID-19. As I say, our world-leading net zero legislation, I think we were the first major economy to legislate for it, as well as a $15 billion commitment for international climate finance. Then the second announcement I wanted to highlight was on the 12th of December, when we marked the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. The UK, the UN and France, in partnership with Chile and Italy, hosted a virtual leader-level climate action summit, climate ambition summit. 75 leaders that day came together to announce new commitments on climate action, including 45 nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, 24 net zero commitments, and 20 adaptation and resilience plans. And the UK itself announced an enhanced NDC that day. The Prime Minister said that we would aim to reach 68% in cuts in our emissions by 2030 compared to the 1990s. So I think, those were the beginning of our run-up to COP26. We will accelerate that agenda through the G7, including, of course, through the Climate Summit this week on Earth Day. And all of that is going to be vital as the world comes together to see how we can meet these ambitions and deal with what is one of the great global challenges. As final point I wanted to make, the UK government the other day, a few weeks ago, published what we call an integrated review, sets out our assessment of the state of the world. It's not particularly happy. And in that, we identified addressing the climate challenge as our #1 international priority. So that's where it sits on the government's priority list. And we need to work together as a global community to address it. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Steer. This is clearly a very difficult time, for many countries as they are still working to get the pandemic under control. Yet COP26 has already been postponed once. So, what do you see the major challenges as well as opportunities for mobilizing global climate action during this, somewhat untraditional year?
Well, thanks, Joanna, and thanks to the School of Foreign Service and Joel Hellman and you all for putting this on. It is an exciting week, and I must say, looking at the other panelists, especially David Turk, epitomizes what a radical change you can have in a government in such a short space of time. I mean, these are very, very exciting times, I think. Look, at one level, we are extremely well positioned. When the Paris deal was agreed in 2015, it was a very risky and very unusual deal. I mean, basically, we've got a global crisis to solve, and we say, okay, everyone can volunteer to try and help solve it. That was the idea, and the hypothesis was the first round of national commitments would be weak, the so-called NDCs, and sure enough, they were weak. They were nowhere near enough. But the hypothesis was that each year that passes, things would happen that would help countries raise their level of ambition. And sure enough, prices of renewables and other technologies fell, citizen voices grew louder and louder, the problem of climate change grew worse. All of these added to the momentum. And in addition to that, we had actually a revolution in economic understanding. We used to believe that addressing climate change would hurt the economy. Nice to do it, but you'd lose jobs and investment. We now know literally from the last 6 years of serious analysis of some of the best economists in the world that actually smart climate action leads to more economic efficiency, it drives new technologies, and it lowers risk. And those three things combined actually lead to more jobs, more investment. And so a very funny thing happened just 2 years ago when the IPCC came out with a report that said we had been aiming at 2 degrees maximum warming. We now realize that's too dangerous. We're going to have to go for 1.5. Everybody said, well, watch out, because leaders won't be willing to go for that because it's too complicated, it's too difficult. And the interesting thing is the opposite happened. A new generation of leaders, especially in the corporate sector, came forward and they said, we're in, count on us. And so you've now got this astonishing situation where over 100 countries accountable for more than 50% of greenhouse gas emissions have committed to go to net zero by the middle of the century. 1,500 major corporations have done the same. 12,000 cities and towns have committed to that. And between $20 and $40 trillion of assets under management are all committed to move towards net zero. We never would have dreamt that that would have happened. It's a remarkable thing. Now, that's the good news. The bad news is, in order for those net zero mid-century commitments to make sense, you need a short-term plan for this decade. And that's where the new generation of NDCs come in. And so far, there have been 79 countries that have issued NDCs, new NDCs. About half, and they account for about 28% of all the emissions in the world. About half of those are an improvement, and the other half are a disappointment. That's why this meeting on Thursday and Friday is so very important, not only because we expect a big commitment from the United States, maybe halving greenhouse gases or carbon from the United States between 2005 and 2030, but also, hopefully, from other important countries like Japan, like Korea, like Canada, that have made commitments to net zero, but actually haven't really yet been clear about what they're going to do. And of course, the big unknown still is China, where we certainly expect that last time's NDC, which was to peak by 2030, that needs to be brought forward. Now, of course, what China is saying is, wait a minute, if we peak at 2030 and we're net zero by 2060, no country in history has gone from maximum to zero in 30 years. Yes, that's fine, but we need to actually peak well before 2030. So what's to play for in COP26? It is first to get early, starting this Thursday, some new commitments that are really bold, and countries like Indonesia and India also need to come forward. But whether it's this Thursday or whether it's sometime in the next few months, so that you start getting a drum roll of enthusiasm. But of course, the NDCs are only one part. Another part that's very important is finance. Private sector finance actually is in much better shape than public sector finance. It's remarkable what's happening in private finance. And people like Mark Carney, the special envoy for climate change finance, is doing an amazing job. But actually on public finance, we're still in a weak position. So we need countries to come forward. And that's why it's so wonderful, the role that the United States is playing, because it sounds like they are willing to really go to bat there and encourage others to do the same. So let me stop there. There's so much more to say, all to play for.
Great, thank you so much. So I'd now like to turn to Dave Turk. You know, there's obviously a lot of excitement right now here in Washington. There was a lot of excitement when President Biden announced that the United States would be rejoining the Paris Agreement, and that he would be hosting a leaders summit on climate change during the first 100 days of his administration. And now we are here, right? The summit is here. So can you please tell us, what does the summit aim to achieve? And from your perspective, what does success look like? And you know, what types of announcements might we expect to see this week from world leaders and from the president?
Well, thanks, Joanna. Thanks not only for moderating this phenomenal panel, but for all that you've done over many years focused on these issues, and to Joel and to our Georgetown University and Foreign Service Foreign School colleagues as well. Thanks to Anthony and our UK colleagues. I feel like every time I run into someone who's with the UK government, I should thank them for all their tireless leadership, their tireless work with the Glasgow COP, with the G7 this year as well. And so thank you for all the leadership from the UK side. And Andrew, let me congratulate you in person. I haven't had a chance to do that with your new job with Bezos. And for those who know Andrew, and if you don't know Andrew, just his years and dedication of work, whether at the World Bank or at WRI. And every time I listen to Andrew, and I'm fortunate to be on a panel with him, I learn something, which is not always the case with all the Zooms that we're on these days. So thanks, Andrew, for all the incredible leadership. And Milan, it's great to see you again. I worked with you back in the Secretary Clinton days at the State Department with a brand new position in your leadership on those issues. And it's great to see that leadership continuing and strengthening over the years, and the inspiration that you are for many, many of us. So let me maybe make 4 points, Joanna, to answer your question in terms of what we're trying to do here this week with the summit, but more generally from the U.S. Side of things. The first point, I think the most important point, if you think about whatever international leverage that a country has, it really comes from what they're doing domestically. It's really walking the walk. And you can talk a good game in the international context, but if you're not actually implementing the kinds of policies, the funding streams, the kinds of infrastructure efforts domestically, and you're not doing your share, then you don't have leverage, you don't have credibility. And there's an awful lot of effort, certainly we're spending at the Department of Energy, but throughout the US government on walking the walk. Again, credit to our UK colleagues. I think the reason they're having a lot of success with Glasgow and the lead up to Glasgow is not just because they have a phenomenal diplomatic corps, which they do, but it's because they're making the domestic changes that they need to, not just the longer term commitments, but the recent actions. I saw a statistic, I think a year or two ago, that the UK emissions, CO2 emissions, are down to roughly the same level that they were in 1880. So 140 years ago. And so UK, I think, is one of those countries really walking the walk. Now, obviously, there's more that needs to be done on that end and a lot of efforts. But I think the UK is ahead of a lot of other countries of taking a net zero commitment and doing exactly as Andrew said. How do you actually get there, right? Not just so you have a nice soundbite from the Prime Minister, but how do you actually implement that and put yourself on a road to do that? So certainly from the US side, you'll hear a lot from President Biden directly, all the secretaries, including my secretary, Secretary Granholm, will be participating, explaining, exploring, laying out what we're doing to walk the walk. And a big part of that is the American Jobs Plan that's pending in Congress right now, a lot of hearings, a lot of discussion, incredible amounts of infrastructure funding, infrastructure writ large on that front. Happy to get into any of that in the question and answer period. So that's the first point I think really needing to emphasize. And we hope we see equally impressive plans, programs, and policies from the major countries who are going to be speaking around the world at the leadership, at the leader level. Second piece, and really building off what Andrew said, is a sense of urgency. Not just a sense of urgency in the rhetoric, but a sense of urgency in the actions. I think it's incredible what we've seen with the net zero commitments that we've seen, not only, as Andrew said, from the country side of things, but from the corporate side of things. If you would have told me we would have had this many net zero commitments on the table 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would have said, you're crazy. But we've done it. And a lot of that's the youth pressure, a lot of that's political leadership, a lot of that's great analysis that's been done to point out, and of course the science telling us we need to have those kinds of levels of commitment. And I think what we'll see this week is not only a focus on 2030 and the NDCs, which are incredibly important in this ratchet up structure that the Paris Agreement put into place, as Andrew said, which is really a revolutionary structure. But I think we need to focus even more, not just on this decade, but on the next few years in particular. I think we've really got to focus the urgency on the now, the stimulus programs, the equivalent of the American Jobs Plan in other countries. If they don't have plans along those lines, they need plans, they need to enact them, and we need to take advantage of this opportunity coming out of the COVID pandemic. I didn't fully understand Georgetown and the foreign schools history of being created coming out of World War I and coming out of the Spanish flu. I think it's a great metaphor and analogy of what we need to do in countries around the world, not just to create phenomenal educational institutions, but to really step up to the plate. Not all years in history are equal. There are some years and moments in history that are more important than others, and I think we're living through one right now. I have to say the latest data coming out is not encouraging. The IEA, my former employer, just came out with their latest assessment of where we're at on global emissions so far for 2021 and extrapolating that for the full year. And what they're showing is global energy-related CO2 emissions are heading for their second largest annual increase ever. So not enough countries are stepping up in the immediacy of this year, next year, to really put in place those kinds of policies that allow us to get to where we need to get to by 2030, that allow us to get to net zero. So that urgency piece, I know I feel that, and I hope that comes through in a variety of leaders' speeches, that it's not just, oh, 2050, I said it, check the box. It's actually rolling up the sleeves, doing the hard work to make the progress right away in the next coming months. Third piece, and Secretary Granholm is going to be helping to coordinate and chair this session, is on innovation. As we focus on doing what we need to do in the near term whether it's on electric vehicles or whether it's on renewables or grids or transmission, all those infrastructure pieces. We need to continue and double down, triple down, or even quadruple down on the funding to reduce those technology price points, not only for our existing technologies, but those critical technologies for hard to decarbonize sectors, whether that's hydrogen, whether that's long duration storage, other kinds of technologies. We need to keep all focused on that side of the equation. And then the fourth piece, and maybe this is a message for our university students in terms of them thinking about their career. Having worked in the international space for quite some time, it's a very multifaceted space. You're not going to have one climate agreement and everybody comes and you're going to solve the problem. There's a variety of public actors, private actors working in a variety of different ways to focus progress on the international side. Some of it may be agreements and collaboration. Some of it may be incentive structures. Some of it may be trade levers. Some of it may be finance levers, other kinds of things that can be done. And I encourage certainly the folks who are paying attention to this from Georgetown, think about what your career is, think about how you can get involved, and think about how you can engage and be part of the solution space in this. It's messy sometimes, the international context, but it requires humans to power that, people to power that, people who make the career choices. Joanna, I'm thinking of all the terrific work you've done personally over many years. We just need a lot more of that if we're going to be successful to get to where we need to go, where science tells us we need to go on the climate change front. So let me leave it there, but hopefully some useful thoughts.
Thanks so much, Dave, and thanks for that great message for our students who are listening in. And that's a great segue to the human dimension of this issue. And I'd like to turn now to Ambassador Bevere. You know, while COP26 is certainly a tool for mobilizing political action, we are, of course, already seeing the impacts of climate change around the world, with fragile states and vulnerable communities often bearing the brunt of these impacts. Could you talk to us about what you see as the opportunities for enhanced international action to address climate change and conflict?
Well, thank you so much, Joanna, and it's great to be here with you. Thank you for bringing us together, and to Dean Hellman for his leadership on this issue as well. And it's gratifying to be part of this distinguished panel. And I must say, thank you for arranging this reunion with Dave Turk, whom I haven't seen in some time, and who is in the enviable position today to be able to carry out the extraordinary efforts that the Biden administration has announced on climate, both domestically and internationally. So Dave, we're counting on you and so many others. I do want to bring this conversation to the ground, if you will. Obviously, the ground needs to inform the policy level, the decision maker level, but it really is about the need for greater political action and international cooperation, because we're already seeing tremendously severe climate impacts that are impacting the lives of so many, and particularly impacting the lives of women by virtue of their lower socioeconomic status in so much of the world. Climate exacerbates vulnerability, and we're beginning to see that in greater troubling ways around the globe. And just as climate affects everyone, it does not affect everyone equally. We've seen that with the pandemic. Women are disproportionately affected in terms of the impacts with the pandemic. And in this case, women are the key providers in many parts of the world of water, food, and energy. And they are already dealing with severe water shortages. They are foraging for wood at longer distances. Forget the fact that that wood is also exacerbating climate changes of its own. And they are trying desperately to provide food because the great majority of smallhold farmers are women, and their lives are becoming more and more difficult. They rely in great measure on natural resources, and so they are facing higher risks and greater burdens from the impacts of climate change. And what we're beginning to see is the loss of livelihoods because of the insecurity that life in agriculture represents, competition, greater competition over scarce resources. The competition and the loss of livelihood is leading to displacement and migration, enhancing tensions and provoking conflict. You see in the Northern Triangle where this is playing out with the drought conditions, land no longer arable, the displacement and the movement of peoples that obviously enhances tensions. You see the looming peril in the Lake Chad region in Africa, where the lake has shrunk by some 90% now. And think of what it did, what it represented for life sustainment in that part of the world. Already seeing looming conflicts with pastoralists and farming communities and everything that competition for diminishing resources represents. So there is a nexus between climate, gender, and conflict. But it's not all the story of vulnerability. And I want us to see not so much the most vulnerable as victims, but as potential problem solvers and agents for change. Women have a critical role to play in adaptation, in mitigation, in resource management, certainly in mitigating climate conflict risks. And just very briefly, I'd like to look at a few of those areas in which their leadership is absolutely critical. Certainly in the realm of agriculture and reducing carbon emissions in agriculture and what livestock tending represents. The majority of smallhold farmers, as I said, are women. Women play a major role, almost half in the agriculture workforce. We need to invest more in climate smart agriculture, technology for more efficient farming, regenerative agriculture. The private sector has become an incredible resource in this space and already active, and in other ways to mitigate the carbon complications that are represented in agriculture. Secondly, women are critical to renewable energy. From installation of many grids that we're seeing through Africa Power, through solar panel installations and other solar technologies, through selling clean energy technologies, huge programs in Indonesia. And as Andrew said, this combination of acting on climate, even with women on the ground, and creating economic viable opportunities for them. In many a place I've seen women do this, and it changes their lives, obviously has impacts on climate, but also tremendously powerful impacts economically and with respect to job opportunity. And we can't hear President Biden anymore without in the same sentence talking about climate and talking about jobs. So I think this connection is one that is really important. And I think is a standout when it comes to dirty cook stoves. Some 3 billion people cook on these dirty cook stoves. That represents close to the combined population of China and India. It is spewing this deadly carbon into the air, having severe health impacts on the people who find themselves in these situations. And we need to move to the technology that replaces the dirty cook stoves and what it is doing in this, emitting these super pollutants that I understand, if addressed, could reduce carbon by some 2%, which is not insignificant. In studies that we have done at the Institute focused on areas with growing tensions. We did a recent study looking at situations in Nepal, Colombia, and Sudan. We can see how the agency of women in those situations has led to a greater ability to address the impacts of climate. So just in sum, where women have been able to overcome the barriers, the structural barriers to their participation, they are more uniquely positioned to contribute to sustainable natural resource management, resilient communities addressing issues of exacerbating tensions. I must say, though, in my frustration, that we have yet to see the kind of consultation that they should be involved in terms of development of programs and policies. And I think inclusion, as the UNFCCC has pointed out, in fact, the overarching language in the Paris Agreement has pointed out, we really need to apply a gender lens to these issues as well, to deal with some of the thorniest complications that this issue presents us with in order to get to more effective actions. So yes, enhanced international cooperation, development partnerships, private sector partnerships, and certainly what a gender lens would represent in all of that. And I'll end there.
Great, thank you so much for that important perspective, I think, in this conversation. I'd like to remind our audience that the question and answers are open, so please go ahead and submit your questions in the box. And I would love to get some questions from some of our students, so please identify yourself when you write your questions so that I can try to flag some of those. We're already getting some great questions, and I'd like to raise one about get the panelists' perspectives on the role of the Paris Agreement going forward, and particularly its resilience. As Dave and others mentioned in your remarks, not enough countries are stepping up to make the real progress we need to see in this decade. Do you think the United States abdicating leadership over the last 4 years irreparably hurt the agreement, or has it made other emerging economies like China, India, Brazil, or other developing countries less likely to take meaningful climate action? And what is the role of other multilateral processes in all of this, including private sector and NGO initiatives? Perhaps Andrew, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, look, the Paris Agreement is the agreement. It's a very good agreement. And the way to think about it, I believe, is that the reason it's doing well is that UNFCCC, that's the Framework Convention on Climate Change, essentially has 3 roles. 1, you set targets. 2, you monitor progress. And 3, you hold players, i.e. countries, accountable. Beyond that, exactly as David said, it actually requires a great deal of energy from a great deal of other players. And that is being actively encouraged, which is really wonderful. The problems that we face cannot be solved by silver bullets, as Dave was saying. It's more of a jigsaw puzzle. You need the different players to come together. I mean, if for example, the issue is by 2035, we have to phase out internal combustion engines for small vehicles. That's what California has said. Now, the United Kingdom has said we're going to do it by 2030. In order for that to work, you need the right players. You need the automobile companies, the oil and gas. You need citizens who are willing to change. You need scientists. You need a whole range of players coming together. The most exciting thing happening today is precisely that. One of the announcements that may be made on Thursday relates to voluntary carbon markets and what you could actually do with voluntary carbon markets for nature-based solutions, where corporations are willing to provide funding, governments are willing to work together with other governments to set up what are called jurisdictional approaches. NGOs and scientists are willing to hold everyone accountable through science-based targets and so on. So that's what's exciting about the Paris deal. I do just want to strongly support with what Ambassador Bavia said. At the end of the day, climate change is a massive moral issue. And I think we sometimes forget that. And that's the great gift that young people have brought us back to. It's a moral issue today, those that are empowered versus those that are disempowered, those that consume a lot and emit a lot compared to those that suffer a lot from those. So there's a problem today. It has gender, race, income, wealth dimensions, and then there's an intergenerational problem, which is even trickier. We are creating a problem our grandchildren will suffer. And so we absolutely must remember to put that central. And one area we are failing in right now, let's be really clear, is that the developing world is feeling marginalized in this debate. And one of the things I know that the British government is trying very hard to do, together with the UN and the US government, most vulnerable countries, low-income countries, feel that they're getting a very raw deal at a time when we are spending $16 trillion on ourselves. Where is the funding for them? At a time when we are all now getting truly vaccinated, they're going to get vaccinated in 2023, 2024. And so that whole idea of trust has been eroded, and we need to invest very heavily in that.
Thank you. Anthony, did you want to jump in on this?
Just very quickly, if I may, and it really picks up where Andrew just left off there. And reading some of the questions in the chat, I think there are some really important themes, including inclusion, as Ambassador Bavia set out, when it comes to women economic engagement in this issue, but also minority groups. This needs to be an inclusive conversation. I think it needs to be heavily, education, I think, is a key part of it as well, not only sort of formal education, but making these conversations more transparent, and I think holding ourselves to account a little bit, as Andrew said then. The other thing, if I may, I just wanted to come back to your question. I mean, I think we were certainly disappointed when the previous administration announced that it would withdraw from the Paris Agreement, and obviously very pleased when President Biden moved so quickly, not only to commit during his campaign, but then immediately after his inauguration to rejoin. I think that is certainly hugely, hugely significant. But the point I just wanted to highlight is just the multifaceted nature of our engagement here in the US. So obviously in the previous administration, it was more difficult to engage, but we were very, very active at state level with governors through the Climate Alliance, with the cities through C40 Alliance, including, of course, here in New York, and Mayor Garcetti over in LA. And then as we keep coming back to the role of the private sector and the academic sector and research institutes, because if all of those aren't firing and getting lined up, then we won't do this. But again, really something that Andrew said in his first remarks, I thought was hugely important. The activism that we are seeing from the private sector, that is, they're not necessarily following a government lead, although I think it's important that governments do lead. But the activism we're also seeing from younger generations and individuals who I think are just really, really challenging their governments in ways that we have not seen before. And I think that's hugely important. Final thought, just again, back to Andrew's point about our responsibility, our moral responsibility to the developing world, whether on the climate front or dealing with the pandemic through COVAX, et cetera. I think this is where we get into the really crucial role of all of the multilateral institutions that we are members of. And we're all members of different ones, but for the UK, I would just highlight two. One is the WTO, where I think the leadership that is being shown already by Dr. Ngozi is just incredibly impressive. And we are certainly engaging very closely with her and her team on that. And there will be a trade track as part of our G7 presidency this year, where these themes will run through that. And secondly, of course, for the UK, the engagement we want to have with the developing world, especially through groups like the Commonwealth. Again, we will be held to account in those groups if we don't show more leadership, more commitment, more action on all of these. And final thought, if I may, just very quickly, there's a question in the chat about whether we should be prioritizing economic recovery from the pandemic over the climate. It can't be a choice. It's got to be both. As I said earlier, both the President, the Prime Minister, and others talking about building back better, more resiliently, more sustainably. There is an opportunity here not only to meet the moral imperative of dealing with climate, but also to make it an economic opportunity. And that's what we have to do. Thank you.
Thank you. I now want to turn to Dave Turk, and I want to fold in an additional question that has come up a couple times now from the audience, which is about how the United States in particular can be more resilient to shifts in executive administration when it comes to international climate agreements, and what role the Biden administration could play in reassuring the international community and potentially implement somewhat more permanent, or is there a way, I guess, essentially to overcome political shifts in US commitment to climate policy.
Well, thanks, Joanna. And let me maybe take one crack at the Paris question and then answer that question as well. And the two are very much, I think, related also. I'd like to think, and Andrew laid this out, I think, incredibly well. The Paris Agreement you can think of as fundamentally a vertical kind of architecture in the international space. It's country determined, nationally determined contributions. We have this 5-year ratchet where each country is supposed to up their ambition, and you'll get to that level of where we need to go in that kind of context. I think the part of the architecture internationally that we don't have as well developed or as far along is a more horizontal slice, is a more sector slice. What's the cement play? What's the chemicals play? What does hydrogen do in these kind of sector horizontal slices? And I don't think that is a UNFCCC UN kind of agreement. I think that's a relatively few number of market leading countries, depending on the particular sector, market leading companies, investors, all trying to come at it from that sector slice. It's a different part of the architecture. I think it's perfectly compatible with that kind of Paris vertical slice piece of it. Secondly, and related into your question, Joanna, directly, in terms of the enduring nature of the US and political support, I think this is the fundamental challenge we have to face over these next 4 years of this Biden administration. And I think the president has laid this out in compelling terms in the campaign and so far in office. And it's something that many of us feel very much in our bones in terms of who we are. I grew up in a small town that had a steel mill that was basically closing throughout my childhood. More people laid off. And I can tell you what that does to a community. I can tell you what it does to some of my friends and their families growing up along those lines. And I think we need to double down, triple down, quadruple down on place-based strategies as we think of this energy transition across the country. If we can't have an energy transition that works for West Virginia, that works for Wyoming, that works for New York, that works for all of our communities, it's the moral thing to do, just as Andrew and Anthony were saying about what we do with developing countries around the world. There's a moral imperative inside of all of our countries too, as the president, I think, has so eloquently put it. And he comes from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And one of the things I admire the most about him is he feels this in his bones. You can't leave anybody behind. You have to have a strategy that works for people. It's a moral imperative, but I think that's also how you build that pragmatic political support for the long term on these kinds of policies, these kinds of programs, these kinds of efforts. And we're spending an awful lot of time here at the Department of Energy and throughout the administration working to really try to figure that out. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require work. It's going to require urgency. But I think that's what it's going to take to make sure that the U.S. is in it for the long haul.
Thanks, Dave. I want to turn to a set of questions that particularly focuses on vulnerable communities to climate change. We've been asked about, particularly in the Pacific Island region, where we have, of course, many islands, where people are losing their homes completely due to climate change. How can Indigenous voices be better centered in these high-level conversations? And then also, how can these sort of big picture tools, available to larger governments and federal governments help to be applied to help solve smaller scale climate change issues, including at the local and village level. Malam, would you like to start us off with this?
Yeah, if I might, Joanna, I'll get to the questions, but let me first follow up where Dave left off in terms of the United States and ensuring that with change of government does not come complete throw out of the progress that hopefully is being made now and will continue to be made. And I think, what he said in terms of everybody seeing the benefits of this is critically important. And that will also impact voters in the future. I think going off the rails in climate could be seen as the politically disadvantageous thing to do. And that's what I think we need to see in grounding this in our country, in grounding this in ways that everybody understands. Yes, it's the right thing to do, but it's the smart thing to do. It's the effective thing to do. It benefits everybody. And it's something we have to stay steely focused on. So political change will not create climate change in the worst way. And then in terms of what Andrew said about climate justice, this perception, and I've heard it in so much of the developing world, it touches on where your question came from. I remember being in the South Pacific and with a group of women at a World Bank meeting in Papua New Guinea. And the first woman who introduced herself said, I'm from, I think it was Kiribati, and our island will be the first one to go completely underwater. The pressing nature of this cataclysmic impact on so many people that many of us do not feel, certainly in the same way, is something we have to pay attention to. And moreover, the moral justice implications of this, that so much is what's happened to the global South has been because of our behavior in terms of the way that we have emitted carbon and created these harmful impacts. And then to what Andrew said about, when the United States, this is going back to your original question on this, Joanna, when the United States got out of the Paris Agreement, the great thing was that our states remained engaged. Many of our cities remain tremendously engaged because they see the impacts, excuse me, at those levels. Our private sector was engaged. And I think now having the national government not just re-engaged, but vigorously engaged should lead us to a place where we can compensate for the kind of abdications and the causes that they've represented over the last 4 years. The questioners are absolutely right in terms of the need to present the participation of what's happening in indigenous communities in the global South really very significantly to decision makers and to policymakers, and for them to take these views into consideration. There have been several attempts to bring indigenous speakers into the realms of these powerful conferences and forums, which often speak at a level that they can't relate to, but where their own lives are what the discussions are all about. The impacts of what's happening to them are all about. So I think we have to factor in their participation, their inclusion more significantly. And I think we have to look at development and how it coalesces more closely to what needs to be done in what we would call the realm of development and addressing the climate impacts in those development solutions, certainly getting at the equality issues. And where all of this started in your question is with the Paris Agreement. And I want to go back to the fact that the overarching language in the Paris Agreement did include gender. Subsequent to that agreement being adopted, there was the adoption of a commitment to a gender, greater gender integration in policies, and then COP23 adopted the Gender Action Plan, and many nationally determined contribution decisions focused on including gender, but not really in terms of manifesting it significantly in the commitments it made. And I think that's where we have to do better on this piece, where it is incorporated in all of our policy decisions in ways that factor in this disparate impact.
Absolutely, thank you. We're getting close to the end of our time, and I'm going to try to squeeze in one more important question given our panel. So there's a question about the fact that the Paris Agreement doesn't have many punishments for countries who fail to meet their goals. and particularly a question about the role for border adjustment mechanisms, such as the EU's proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism. And since we have Her Majesty's Trade Commissioner for North America, Anthony, I wonder if you could comment on that briefly.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's a hugely important topic. I think I have sort of two observations. They may not be particularly sophisticated, but I think it's, again, on the Paris Agreement, picks up on Andrew's initial comments that, the Paris Agreement was a particular type of agreement at the time that I think the point for me is it can't remain static. We need to keep updating it. It needs to remain, to David's point, actually, if it's going to be that sort of vertical architecture, what are the enhancements it needs in order not only to enhance the ambition and go from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees, but also to make sure that it actually has the desired impact in the real world. And I think that's the important thing about Glasgow this year, is it's a chance to sort of bring the community back together, update that sense of ambition, as the title of this event says, turn that ambition into action and take it forward from there. And then on carbon border adjustment mechanism, I mean, I think, again, a really vibrant debate. I think the EU is making certain moves. The UK is certainly looking at how this fits in order to avoid carbon leakage. Certainly, John Kerry was quite vocal on this after his trip to London and Brussels a few weeks ago. And again, I think whether it's through the G7 or through the WTO or through the G20 or at COP itself, we need to work out a global approach to this, because if we don't all address the issues, if we don't all set the same level of ambition, commit to the same level of action, I'm not sure, I could be wrong on this, by the way, but just to think openly, I'm not sure about how you build in sort of punishment mechanisms, because I think, what I think we need to do is just keep encouraging this sense of sort of almost bottom-up activism that is really sort of forcing leaders in the private sector, public sector, and elsewhere to have the, to meet their commitments. I think that's probably the better way into it, not least because I think, as in a previous part of the conversation, this sense that in some parts of the world are being treated differently compared to others. Let's not exacerbate that by sort of giving people a sense that they're going to be punished if they, for whatever reason, can't make certain commitments. But huge important topics, and that's why I think, as I said earlier, in our integrated review, climate is the #1 priority of the British government, and I think that's a statement of our intent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I want to echo everyone's thank you to the UK government for all the tireless work that is happening throughout this year to bring the COP to fruition. I want to give Andrew and Dave about 30 seconds for any final remarks. If there's anything else you'd like to say, Andrew.
Well, I love the question in the question and answer. Do we find inspiration from climate fiction? And I want to think about that, but my immediate thought is we don't need fiction. You couldn't make this stuff up. It is scary. And it is wonderful to hear the United Kingdom is making this the #1 priority. It is wonderful what the United States is doing, summoning the leaders on Thursday and Friday. And we just need to make this the exciting adventure and challenge of our lives.
Maybe from my end, Joanna, just to build on exactly what Andrew said, and many have raised this. This is the moment. This is the few years here. This is where we either get our acts together, whether it's a country or a company or investors. We send those trajectory of emissions going in a different way, in a just way, in a way that lifts people up all around, not only the US, but around the world as well. I would also say, again, appealing to the students who are part of this call, pick a career that you're going to feel proud about and you're going to be fulfilled in. And I can't think of a more interesting set of issues to get into. If you're internationally inclined, working on clean energy, working on climate change, working on the issues Milan has devoted yourselves to, you can earn money and do other things, but you can also have a career that you find incredibly fulfilling and that helps make the world a better place. And there's just such a huge opportunity space here for those who are eager to roll up their sleeves and get to work.
Thank you. And there was a question about how students can get involved in the run-up to COP26 this year. And will there be opportunities to attend? I try to bring students every year to the COPs. Georgetown is an accredited observer to the UNFCCC. So should we be allowed to attend in person, we'll see how that goes. Of course, this is a challenging year. And if not this year, there will certainly be opportunities down the road for students to attend these meetings. And with that, I'm afraid we're out of time, but on behalf of Georgetown School of Foreign Service and the STIA program, I want to sincerely thank everyone for joining us for this important conversation today, and especially our panelists for taking the time to speak with us during what is, of course, a very busy week in the climate world, and for sharing your insights and perspectives. We look forward to following the outcomes of this week's summit and the other events leading up to COP26 later this year. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.